Hello and welcome to Real Estate Expo and Conference second edition, taking place today and tomorrow. We have a great lineup of distinguished, amazing speakers, as well as very interesting talks your time with us throughout the coming 2 days. We want to thank all our speakers and sponsors for being with us, staying without you. Let us begin our very first session for the second edition, which is about emerging trends in urban development. We are very honored to have Mr. Hazem Galal, PwC, cities and local government global leader, to be talking about. Welcome, Hazem.
Thank you, Mai, and welcome everybody. It's a pleasure for me today, and just loading up my presentation here. Hope you can all see it on the screen. My name is Hazem Galal. I lead PwC cities and local government work globally. And what I will be discussing with you for the next 30 minutes are some of the emergent trends that we see today in urban development, of course, with a deep dive in real estate. So I'll structure my presentation today around 3 areas. I'll start with talking about cities as the engines for economic development. Then we're going to talk a little bit about what has COVID done to cities today and what are some of the things that are changing in the thinking about how cities are managed, designed, and which sectors have been impacted by COVID and how. And then finally, we're going to have a futuristic outlook in terms of, what's next and how does this impact people and businesses around the world in cities. So with the first thing about cities being the engines of growth, if we think about what are some of the global mega trends that are happening today, we have demographic shifts, whether it's aging in Europe and some parts, of the more developed countries. And it's also a very young population in developing countries. We have also economic shifts that are happening. There is a gradual shift from west to east with the MENA region and other hubs at the middle of this economic shift that is happening. We've seen also the rise of the BRICS at some point. It's expected that China will overtake the US soon. And at the same time, we also have the technological innovations enabling us to do things and manage cities and provide services and even design properties and real estate, smart buildings and all of these kind of things in ways that we haven't seen. We have climate change. We've seen how a lot of cities are more subject to, floods, desertification. We're having a lot more natural events, be it in terms of sort of like disasters or any of these events happen more frequently. And then also we have increased urbanization. So the percentage of people living in cities today compared to rural areas has been on the rise. In some parts of the world, like Egypt and the MENA region, this is way above 80% of the population living in cities compared to rural area. And this trend continues as cities generate a lot more economic opportunities for employment and so forth, leading to higher rates of migration. And I would argue that cities are where really all of these 5 global mega trends that we've been witnessing come together and interact. And therefore, that requires us to deal with a lot of challenges that we have in cities in terms of the scarcity of capital, in terms of basically sometimes the fragmentation in governance, in terms of some cities even have scarcity of land. They don't have enough land to accommodate their population expansion. Think about the cases of Singapore, for example, and Hong Kong, and really other sort of like challenges that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. But with 6.8, almost 7 billion of the world's population by 2050 living in cities, we really have to think about how do we approach the way that cities are being designed and operated, and actually, how do we, within this framework, think about the real estate sector? How does it fit in there? How will people have new places to live, work, and play? And what does that mean in terms of, the city management, be it on the planning phase or in the operation phase? And that happens usually through a certain set of enablers, technology being an important one of them. Leadership is very important. If you look at a lot of the cities globally that are really doing well, and you see how charismatic, how innovative, and how the mayors of these cities are demonstrating really a way to bring in different stakeholders, be it from the private sector, from NGOs, from leading citizens, universities, working with the national government in a very proactive way to bring all of these stakeholders together and really get the maximum potential from the cities. Moving forward into the characteristics of what makes a city basically a future-ready city. And this is based on work that we've done with the World Economic Forum, where I spend a lot of my time personally part of the Global Future Council for the cities of tomorrow. So we've looked at the characteristics of future cities and what makes a city competitive. It has these 8 characteristics. It has to be sustainable. And when we talk about sustainable, we don't only mean sustainability from the environmental point of view. It has to be economically sustainable. It has to be socially sustainable in terms of social inclusion, in terms of providing services also to those groups who are underprivileged economically. It has to be able also to be environmentally sustainable, to be weathering floods or any other disasters, and to use its resources in a sustainable way. It has to be citizen-centric, so the design of the services and the planning is really done with a way that would actually put the citizen in mind and the resident in mind first, in terms of how easy for them it is to receive the urban services, be it mobility, be it permits, or any one of these other services that a citizen would receive on a day-to-day basis. Economically vibrant, it has to provide the type of economic activities, jobs, and differentiate itself to attract capital and create these opportunities. It has to be accessible. And when we talk about accessibility, we're not only talking about accessibility for the handicapped, but it also has to be accessible for the elderly, for children, and everybody who's living in the city. And that accessibility manifests itself in every single interaction that the citizen or even the visitor will have with the residents. I remember being in Rio de Janeiro before it hosted the Olympics, and a big problem at that time was you were going to have the Olympics and then the Paralympics with a lot of athletes coming and using wheelchairs, but the buses in the city were not really prepared, and the public transportation and the ramps basically on the streets and all of that, on-ramps, off-ramps from the pavements, were not prepared. And the city used this event to become better prepared for accessibility of wheelchairs. It has to be resilient, and with resilience we mean specifically the ability to deal with natural threats, be it floods or any of the other potential natural disasters, or also as we move towards more digital services, we're also talking about cybersecurity threats, hacking, and all of that. That becomes also part of resilience. Has to be well governed in terms of the agility of the governance, in terms of the ability not to manage the city in silos, but to manage it in an integrated way. It has to be innovative And most importantly, it has to be well planned in terms of the master planning, in terms of the land use. How do you make sure that you start designing compact neighborhoods where people can work, live, and play without having to do a lot of cross city mobility trips that would add to the commute time, lost economic opportunity, and pollution? So these are all the characteristics. This is in a great world where COVID doesn't exist. All of these characteristics basically still exist, but COVID has really impacted cities in an unprecedented way and has generated a lot of thinking and rethinking about how are some of the concepts that we've held in city planning and operations for a long time. For example, before COVID, we used to promote public transport quite a bit. But then with COVID, there is a reduced capacity in public transport and a rethinking in terms of, okay, what does that mean in terms of operating the city's public transport system with a 30-40% capacity to observe social distancing? What does that mean in terms of, for example, smart mobility and to be able to provide your city residents and visitors with different mobility options where basically the user can choose between time, impact on environment, cost, and maybe degree of exposure to COVID or any other threat. Now, what this slide is showing you here is that unfortunately in the past 20 years, the frequency of these natural disasters are increasing. And then I go back to the point that I made earlier about city resilience and the ability to deal with these threats. So one thing, I personally believe in, unfortunately, that the frequency of these natural disasters are going to continue around the world and in cities specifically, because that is just the impact of climate change and the high density that we have in city and many other factors. So what this means and what COVID has been teaching us is that we have to be better prepared for the next natural disaster, because one thing for sure, the frequency is going to keep rising and the impact is going to be higher. And it's the same things that make cities basically the attractive economic engines that they makes them also more vulnerable for disasters like COVID and have the impact, whether because of its higher concentration of people, the density, the reliance on public transport. Some cities serve as global or regional or national travel hubs, so many people come through them, and that increases the exposure and brings more additional threats. And it's interesting, if you look here at different cities around the world, initially at the beginning of COVID, cities have typically had a higher percentage of COVID cases compared to the national total, as compared to with the percentage of the population. So in many of these cities, when COVID hit first, you had a much higher, New York being a very clear case, where at some point it accounted for more than 30% of the US cases of COVID, whereas population-wise, it's around 5%. So these are just examples that show us that we really have to be careful in cities and be better prepared and have better sort of like thinking and planning for disasters like COVID, because these are the places that they're going to be vulnerable. And city mayors and governors and decision makers have had, as we have seen in the past year, to struggle between two very important decisions, what we call the twin challenge. Do you actually close down the city and try to reduce basically your exposure to COVID and to spreading the disease and prioritize protection and healthcare? Or do you keep the city open and keep the economy open and maximize basically economic activities? So how do you balance between these two conflicting priorities of keeping the economy going on one side and protecting your citizens and people? And many cases, actually, it goes through waves. So, after you've actually closed off for a while, you start improving your health and well-being numbers, number of cases go down, you open up, and then you go again. So we get all of these different types of recoveries, whether it's W-shaped or V-shaped or whatever type of recovery. So these have been very difficult decisions to deal with. And what we have started also to think about is what has been the impact on the different sectors, right? So we've seen, for example, uh, a very positive impact on technology and communications, where people started to work more from home. The use has actually increased. Cities and countries started to invest more in digital infrastructure. So that was overall positive, as compared to, for example, real estate, where the impact has been mixed. So initially, it has gone down in many cases in terms of transactions, and even in some cases, the supply chains and access to construction material was disrupted, which has impacted the work of a lot of master developers and people working in the industry. But interestingly enough, in places, for example, or in cities like Dubai, as people started to be more locked in, there was a big group of people who started, looking for bigger space, because people now started to work from home, and they realized that, the 2 rooms that they had before, they need to upgrade that to maybe 3 rooms to have an office and so forth. So, for example, the real estate market here in Dubai has seen a movement where a lot of people were also upgrading their homes to deal with the reality of basically working from home and what the kind of pressures that this creates. And it would be interesting in different markets to see how these reactions have changed over time. The other important thing also is it started to put a new way of thinking about how to design buildings. During the pandemic, a lot of the buildings that were created initially to become sports arenas, stadiums, or any other sort of like different use have ended up being used in some cities as medical facilities, temporary hospitals, and so forth. And even some hotels are still being used as quarantine places for new arrivals in cities. In Australia, for example, if you arrive from abroad, it's mandatory that you spend 14 days in quarantine, paid for by the traveler. And all of a sudden you have a different type of use for your typical hotel room, where it's no longer basically just a hotel room, but it became a quarantine place. So some of the trends that a lot of designers and planners started to think about is we had to adjust all of these assets and all of this space to be multi-purpose, right? It wasn't designed for this from the beginning. Shall we start thinking right now, when we're designing, real estate place and hotels and different office space, public space, so that it can be, with minimal changes, be repurposed and multi-purpose? That's a very important question that a lot of designers and master developers around the world are starting to think about that. In addition to that, we started to think also about some of the concepts about urban density, and what does that mean? Basically, is density good, or is it something that you need to be able to change as the city operates in terms of its public transport capacity? So you would almost need like 2 sets of policies for your public transport services, one while the city is running in its normal mode, and the other one if it's running under some kind of a lockdown mode or partial lockdown. And that becomes very important in designing mobility as a service and so forth. So these are all new trends and new ways. Obviously the pattern from working from home is on the rise. I have personally been averaging, maybe at least 2 days or 3 days a week where I'm working from home. So what does that mean in terms of connectivity to the home? What does that mean to the amount of real estate space that should be provided for businesses? Is it going to be the same ratios? Are we going to be repurposing some of this space that historically went to office space to become used for other purpose? All of these are very important questions, that we really have to start thinking about moving forward. And the best way to do this is to start thinking about this as a city in a very integrated way. So we've designed this framework that we've used in a lot of conversations with mayors around the world, from cities like Helsinki, Singapore, and others, where you actually have what we call the threat defense cycle. So as a city, you start not thinking about how to react to a disaster like COVID, but you start with what we call the sensing phase. And this is a phase where a city will have to use data analytics, start monitoring for early signals of a potentially coming disaster, and start to actually think about how it can become better prepared, do a lot of scenario projections, a lot of modeling, so that when an actual disaster happens, that is not a surprise, and it become very well prepared with all the scenarios that will have to come with that. Then the next step of that is the defend, how to defend yourself from such a disaster. And then you move on basically to all the way through actually the recovery. And you need to be doing this thing with the economic, the environmental, and the social elements of a city, and doing this with all the different stakeholders in the city, the private sector, the other government departments, the citizens, the NGOs, and so forth. So it becomes a very integrated way that a city thinks about how it's actually going to be better prepared for the next crisis, God forbid. And here, basically, we detail the different elements of social, economic, and environmental. And most importantly are the enablers, as we call them, in terms of the governance, technology and innovation, and your capacity as a city to defend these threats. And that requires a city to engage with the private sector, in many ways, so that it's able to provide these solutions and become ready. And that obviously includes, the real estate industry and master developers and many, many others in the different sectors. So that becomes a very essential way of how to plan and operate your city. So what is it that we're seeing also happening in what does that mean for everyone in terms of the real estate sector? So I will share with you here some findings based, we've been working and doing a lot of research in the real estate sector, for the past 40 years. And what I would like to share with you, in the interest of time and being conscious, that we only have about 5 or 6 minutes left, are what are some of the things that we've seen in other parts of the world, from our research with the Urban Land Institute, for example, and many other partners like the World Economic Forum. And in many ways, there is, we look at what's happening with capital, what is happening with investor focus, what is happening with the changing priorities, and what is happening also with net zero or sustainability, right? So with the change of working habits that I've talked about earlier, and if you think about what happened in the real estate sector in Europe, for example, with millions of people starting to work from home, the retail sector being, going back and forth between lockdown and being partially liberated, that created a lot of interesting dynamics, right, that we will share with you here. And then I'm not sure if we will have a bit of time towards the end for questions or not. So what are some of the trends that we've seen in the European real estate market, right? There is pent-up capital. So that's the good news. Basically, there was a lot of capital that was raised prior to the pandemic. A lot of countries in Europe were attracting also, especially to the real estate sector, like Portugal and Greece and so forth. We're offering golden visa, based on investment and real estate. That has really, led to a lot of new, basically, additional capital coming in. So the good news basically is that there is capital and pent-up demand. My understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, that Egypt also continues to, the market continues to develop, especially with some of the mega projects, that are being offered, be it in the new administrative capital, also the other, sort of like greenfield cities and communities that are coming up everywhere in the country. So capital is there, but there is at least in Europe, a temporary, let's pause a little bit before we announce some new projects and see what's happening, basically, until we actually, see what will look like in a post-COVID world. What would that mean in terms of, maybe new regulations or new ways of thinking about how, the mix of real estate between office space and different type of uses that will be offered. The other thing which we've seen as well is that there is a tendency for investors to focus more on the local markets, right? In situations of risk and disaster, the investors would usually tend to focus inwardly on the environment that they know best, and less appetite to go internationally and to expand beyond the markets that they really know. Yeah. Again, like what we said, there is a very important right now thinking and linkage more than ever of highlighting the role of real and its linkage to health and well-being of societies. With a lot of people locked at home, they want to be in a more comfortable environment. With a lot of people working from home, they want to make sure that their homes have the right connectivity, their homes have some space that would allow them to work, and even, within communities, that there is common areas where people could go and walk, even if they don't have the chance to entertain themselves outside of the building or the area that they live in. And it doesn't have to be fancy compounds. Even in buildings, like in Singapore, that are even intended for low and medium income housing, they still had common areas, which proved to be very important during the time of COVID. In terms of the shifted priorities, basically, that shifted the priorities. So the market beneficiaries have shifted. We started to think, emphasize more on smart buildings and also being able to run buildings in a more efficient way, whether by introducing building integrated management systems, so that you're able in many ways to embed technology that might cost you a little bit higher in the beginning when you're actually constructing, but over the lifetime of the asset, basically that would lead to a lower operating cost. Now, obviously, one of the biggest issues in the industry right now is the fragmentation of the value chain. So it's not necessarily the same entity that builds is actually going to be doing the operations. But in cases where these two parts are integrated, and a lot of the master developers have their own facilities management companies, that becomes an incentive basically to be able to design and build some of these more intelligent systems. And then last but not least is, again, technology coming together with climate change, as we talked earlier, to make sure that, again, our communities and buildings are more resilient to some of these risks like flood and so forth. And basically, we're better prepared for the rest of the natural disasters that unfortunately are going to keep hitting us in the future. With that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you very much. I don't know if we have time for questions or what is the next step. I'll go back to the moderator.
Thank you, Hazem. Thank you. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions, but thank you very, very, very much for this amazing session.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you very much.
The pleasure and honor is ours.